Zazaj. And with that, you know the name of the fourth race of Cosmic. No, I'm just kidding. Welcome to Prototype. It is episode 7. We are talking today about resource changes. And I guess maybe if I have time and the wherewithal, I will comment on some of the ideas that I've been kicking around for the Protoss power rework, for maybe some Zerg related stuff in a similar vein. And also, something that I've been thinking about is, as you might have guessed based on that intro, maybe there could be a fourth race. You never know, bro. Things could get real wacky if we end up expanding a bunch of stuff, but not so sure about that. I guess I can front load this episode by talking about the fact that the last couple of days have been very productive. I am currently on day 3 out of 4 in a row off, which, was happening anyway, but now that I've been able to reduce my hours at work thanks to the generous contributions of the coffee crew, which is now called Chad's Charming Chapel and includes Ahmed's Arson Isle and Tony's Talking Tower on the Discord server. Without those guys, man, well, I would have way less threes. So shout out to you guys. We now have 3 threes. So check that out. But thanks to those guys, I've been able to do a little bit less of the real life drudgery work, a little bit more of the real life smashing work, which is also translating to more exciting changes and ideas over in your guys' neck of the woods, because we're talking about changes to Cosmonarchy Brood War, goddammit. So I hope you guys have been having a blast with the fact that the unit limit is much harder to hit now. And if you have encountered any bugs or instability, please do report them, because we are working diligently to resolve them as soon as they appear, assuming we can actually reproduce them, of course. So there's a lot more to come in that department. But CMBW, Cosmonarchy Brood War, our total conversion is actually getting to the point where we can call it a total conversion thanks to all of the art updates that have been happening lately. That being said, let's comment a little bit more specifically about the main topic of today's episode. That is, of course, the resource changes that hit on the day that we are actually recording this, which is the 24th of March, 2023. We have decided that we're going to try to reinstate diminishing returns on the workers, and Veek and myself were the main people behind this change. He proposed an idea, and I said, okay, let's test that out. One of the main things we're trying to do is achieve a bit of a slower ramp-up time so that you stay within the early game, tier 1, etc., for a little bit longer. And we didn't really want to slow the game down to a grinding halt. We still wanted interesting decisions to be made. So we're going to get a little bit of interesting feedback related to that, because I do think that it does slow the game down quite a bit at the beginning. But also all of the maps pretty much need to be updated, right, as a result of the change that we did. So what did we do as far as a change goes? We made it so that now your first worker will still obviously operate at 100% efficiency, which means it is never waiting to harvest a resource. It is always able to start harvesting and then return, and then there's like that in-between time where there's a little bit of a gap. The second worker, however, will be roughly half as efficient as the first. So if you, by default, are getting 8 resources per worker, because say you're on a mythical map that doesn't currently exist but it has only 8 mineral nodes, like they all return 8 minerals, then when you add a second worker to one of them, you will be getting 12 minerals on average per 2 returns or whatever, right? Because or whatever, like you're only going to 1.5x your investment because you're only getting 150% efficiency off of the second worker, right? Or 50% efficiency, I guess. Dude, percentages are hard and dumb and unintuitive to me, probably because I'm dumb. So we'll just continue on with the explanation despite my inability in math. And obviously this means that more resource nodes will be required, which means more workers will be required. And that's assuming we want to get back to the income levels of the previous version of the economy, right? So, there's maybe an argument to say that you should actually exist in a bit of a lower econ state or whatever. But so far, after some tests with the Shambler, who was kind enough to donate his time. I don't know where, there was like a G word I was looking for there. He was kind enough to donate his time towards the cause of attempting to figure out how exactly beneficial or not this was and what the effects were. And I felt personally as a player, maybe again, it's just me getting reused to the system. I did feel like I was really desperate to do something in the early game to get the economic advantage, probably because all of the internal like muscle memory and intuition that I had developed over playing, hundreds of games of Cosmonic Brood War hitherto were telling me that I must have like lost workers or something because I don't have a great economy. But when you're in the state in the game where you expect a certain amount and then you get less than that, obviously that means that it's a little bit challenging to convince yourself that actually everything is fine. So yeah, these are all some thoughts. These are all some initial, very, very quick, we played maybe 3 or 4 games, right? Not really anything crazy. Very fast games as well, except for one of them that was on a map that definitely wasn't fit for purpose, but enough about that. But enough about the Shamblers maps. I think probably the best thing that I took away from the tests, or like the most notable thing I took away from the tests, was that it felt a little bit I couldn't really flow into whatever my first production structure was without cutting a worker unless I was willing to wait for something like on the order of 12 workers, definitely double digit workers, right? Which is a significant change because the exact change that we did means that now you harvest resources at a reduced, a longer rate. Each resource takes a longer time. So this does increase the base amount of time it takes to get up to a certain number of resources. So like an alternate solution to this would have maybe looked like not touching the harvest time at all, but making it so that workers move faster so that you still effectively have the, whatever the harvest time is by default, the idle worker is actually is going to be there for about half of the harvest time. That's the idea anyway. So that would still result in the same thing. But that would probably have resulted as well in workers themselves being very easy to move around and very fast to move around, and maybe that makes scouting a little bit too silly or something. Certainly makes catching the workers maybe a bit too silly if you're trying to chase a worker scout or something. And we can already imagine that might not be the ideal situation for the game. I suppose what you could do, though, and one of the things that I observed, I can't remember where this was. It might have just been in Pr0totype or something. But I was talking with Mesk about the way that workers behave with the whole flingy deceleration acceleration thing. And this actually leads to a lot of really silly behaviors. If people don't know, one of the reasons why it's so hard to be sassy with your workers sometimes when you're trying to tickle somebody is because one of the reasons why workers feel so unresponsive in that kind of situation is because they do have acceleration and deceleration. So if we were to remove that and make this basically an iScript type unit, which means that it's governed by the same commands that govern like a Zethercore or a Maverick or Drakodin or something like that, a more conventional unit that doesn't have any of this acceleration nonsense. Like the Vulture is an example of a unit that has acceleration, and obviously pretty much all air units. I can't think of one that doesn't. So these are all examples of units which do have the acceleration and deceleration. And I didn't touch those values for the workers, but I did make them a lot more responsive in general for other units. And so when you consider it stuff like through that lens or whatever, you are definitely going to be seeing, if we decide to pull that trigger, you could definitely see some improvements to the workers in terms of their handling, which would obviously also increase their general rate of harvest, because it decreases the time that they spend sort of delaying before they return the resource and also delaying before they start harvesting the resource, because obviously the acceleration time means that they have to decelerate to something close to a full stop before they can actually do anything. So it's a little bit silly, obviously, that Blizzard left the workers in that state, but because the workers were in that state for so long, it obviously dictated a huge amount of the game, and it definitely means that, for example, the worker wandering behavior, which I'm very glad we removed, actually did result in a lot of diminishing returns for additional workers. This one is a little bit easier to understand. You don't, as Fuguto put it, need a graph to understand your return rates based on the number of workers you task on a node or whatever, because we don't have the wandering anymore. So you pretty much know, unless a resource field is super far away from a town center, and I mean super far away, 5-6 tiles or whatever, additionally to what it normally needs, then you probably are good with just one worker. I mean, 2 workers, excuse me. You probably don't need a 3rd worker for maximum saturation. And as a result of that, you're in a pretty good spot for just knowing that even if the resource node is a little bit farther than normally what you would really see as optimal, your workers can actually still harvest it just fine because of the increased harvest time itself. So yeah, that might be something to take a look at. If you're interested in testing this out, you can, of course, go to pre-release. I guess it would probably have been smart for us to roll back these changes or hold back on sending these changes up and then push current pre-release over to the changes of the release branch or whatever. We were kind of loath to do that because we're also still testing the extenders and there's definitely some instability. But, whatever, you kind of have to do that anyway at this point. So that might have been a smart move just so that we could have kept a relatively close eye on what the resource changes actually were without having to go back to a very old version of the game that in this case doesn't even have some core critical bug fixes and also critical extenders and stuff. So that's maybe a little bit silly that we didn't do that. But beyond that particular quirk, I do think that this will eventually lead to a healthier game. And even if we don't end up leveraging this method, if we just end up reverting it completely and then being like, all right, we're done, a failed experiment. At the very least, we've tested this hypothesis. And so I am appreciating people's patience in testing out these changes and whatnot. And I guess if you have any bit of tech savviness and you're really not a fan, one of the things that you can do is you can do a git checkout command in your command prompt inside your pre-release folder to go back to one of the older versions, and it should work just fine. So it's not really that difficult to do, but I understand if some people don't want to use git, then they don't have to, right? And git is really dumb, so I agree. I can't really say fuck you git, though, because it doesn't roll off the tongue in the same degree as fuck you Visual Studio. So to restate the goals of this update, obviously we want to have the early game take a little bit longer to conclude. We would like players to be able to expand or do other economic plays prior to worrying about building a crazy large army. I don't think that this change alone is going to make that happen, but it is an important change in general because expanding previously wasn't as valuable as it would be now because of the fact that when you transfer your workers, you are not really gaining any efficiency because they were already perfectly doubly efficient when you were stationing them in the old system, right? In the system that is currently on release and in the system that was on pre-release up until earlier today. That system doesn't really account for diminishing returns on workers, and therefore expanding is actually not as valuable. I mean, it still is valuable and perfunctory. You still have to do it because you still want gas and you still want map control and stuff. But it kind of occupied this weird state in the early game, especially where maybe you don't really care that much about doing it. And so this should make that a much more impactful decision. However, I think in addition to this, we're probably going to need to increase the resource costs of production structures, but decrease their time costs, which is going to basically make it a wash as to how soon you start building them, or how soon your first one finishes, I should say. But additional ones will require a little bit of an increased investment. And that means scaling up your early game army is going to be a choice that you have to consider a little bit more carefully. And the reason I think this is going to be a good thing for the game is because, currently, because of the fact that minerals used to be anyway so super easy to come by, now they're a little bit harder, obviously, because of those eco changes I referenced. You kind of just spam a bunch of barracks or whatever and you're fine. Now I think it's going to be a little bit of a different argument once we get our heads around this new system with the harvest rate change. But I do think that what you'll see is a series of cases where a player going for an extra barracks or especially an extra fulcrum or a couple of extra fulcrums with these economic changes where we actually increase the resource costs. That's a significant calling card where if you scout that, then you can expect more units. And then you can also expect that they're not going to be able to expand as quickly because not only have they paid the upfront cost of the production structure, but they're also going to be spending money on the actual units that production structure trains. So I think that's a pretty huge deal. If you see, an in-base macro hatch or a Larvos colony or something, you expect something very different, probably some sort of very killer timing attack with a lot of units than if you just see a expand from a Zerg player, right? And the same thing really should be true for the other races, I think, at least in the early game before you really have a bunch of bases set up and you can afford to do that without really telling your opponent much of anything other than, I want more units, which is pretty normal. So I think that, that adds value to that mid-game scout, or not even mid-game, but 3-4 minute scout, re-scout your opponent and stuff. That adds a lot of value to that, I think. So yeah, you're going to have to bear with us while we try out some of these ideas. I don't really think they're particularly crazy, but for sure we will eventually arrive at a very exciting state of play. This version might not be for everybody in the immediate moment, especially since a lot of the maps haven't been updated. But I thought I would give you guys a bit of an update as to what our reasoning is behind it anyway. The resource node count, I think, because something that Veek7 said that I definitely agree with, is that we can get away with having a lot more nodes, which also means we can then encourage people to build workers for longer into the game. I think if we can get to around 30 workers per base, or at the very least per mains and maybe per nats as well, then that's probably a fairly healthy count for the average like mixed base, right? We're not talking about like gas only bases and stuff. So I was thinking we probably want, a geyser and 2 ridges might be the new standard now. I definitely think that like somewhere between 10 and 12 mineral nodes is probably going to be fairly standard. But, you can even bump both of those counts up slightly, and that would give you up to 15 nodes total. 15 nodes being that number for, obviously, if you have 1.5 efficiency, then maximum saturation would be 2x per node. So that's sort of what we're thinking about. And in general, I think it's a lot more easy to grasp any sort of changes that we make to the system now that wandering has been removed. There is a little bit of a confusing situation because of the worker stacking, where as a result of you like just having all of those stacked workers, it can be difficult to see what nodes actually need resources or more workers. Veek actually proposed a solution where if you click on a mineral field and you or your ally has workers harvesting it, you can actually see how many workers are harvesting it. Like it draws the harvest link line, but not everybody plays with those on. So I guess that might end up becoming perfunctory if we ended up doing that, just because it's super easy to use that for a read. Although it's not perfect, because if the workers are occupying pretty much the same space, which can happen very easily, then the lines will look identical. There's no indication that it's like stacked or anything, right? So I don't know what to do in that situation, but it is pretty annoying. But stacking is pretty annoying. Stacking is stupid. You shouldn't have workers or air units that can just stack on top of each other. I actually don't know what you would do about burrowed units. I guess burrowed units would not allow burrow on them, right? They would be treated as like unburrowable terrain or something. But we don't plan a burrow, at least in our first game, so we don't really have to worry about that in Antikythera, but it's just something that's like a little silly too, right? Like there's another case where you can stack shit pretty much infinitely. We're all familiar with the meta in Default Brood War, where you Dark Swarm a bunch of stacked lurkers, and then they just tickle people to death. Especially up a ramp where half of your shots miss anyway. Dark Swarm just makes that 100%, so it's a nice removal of RNG, Yeah, so I think we're going to see an update to all the maps to include more resource nodes. I do think I'll experiment with converting workers to iScript units just to see if that alone allows us to reduce the harvest time, like the delay it takes, a little bit more, because it's now 5.2 seconds and it used to be like 3 point something. I think it was like 7.25 or something like that. Anyway, this is a significant, nerf to that, if you want to call it that. And I think maybe it might be a little bit too far. And I think we can claw back some of the harvest time. Like we can, claw back chip away a little bit at that nerf, and also improve worker responsivity by turning them into iScript units. So I will be experimenting with that, and we can see how what that looks like exactly. I do also think that in addition to this change and the proposed change for like increasing the production costs, I mean, I would probably increase tech costs for Zerg structures as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It might be better to increase the cost of the Larvosk. And then maybe like, I'm really hesitant to raise the time it takes for like the larva to generate or whatever, but I guess if we really felt like Zerg were too powerful in that department, we could make Larvosks specifically generate slower or something. I don't know. But yeah, there's also a number of other things that I can talk about here before we close things out, because actually it didn't really take that long to sum up all the eco changes and the philosophies behind them. Of course, I should mention as a disclaimer in general, if there's ever a case where we have a change that we're testing and you feel very against it and want to contribute your reasoning as to why, of course we'll engage with you. And also, if we ourselves are not convinced that it's a value add, of course it will be removed and reverted, and we'll go back to what we had before with the knowledge that you know what? Maybe that approach isn't the right one. At the very least, we'll edit the approach if we think we can maybe still salvage it and go an interesting direction with it. So it's not like this is for sure going to be the case, right? So don't lose hope if you're not immediately sold. But yeah, definitely something that is going to take some getting used to. I'll tell you that much. Whatever you do, don't try to also play Protoss on this because it is, you have to get used to the new control scheme for the command card anyway. So very silly. Double trouble. Protoss was not just going to get a command card change, though. I was thinking about significant revision to how the production worked in general. So we all know that pylons have been under some scrutiny. If you've been watching the castovers or engaging with maybe some of the stuff on Fraudarchy and whatnot, you may have seen that I was discussing that pylons feel really dumb. And the reason why I think pylons feel really dumb is you kind of just throw them anywhere and you're not super punished. Now, it's a little bit different because minerals are now more expensive, so maybe that's a little bit different, right? Minerals take a little bit longer to get to now. But, by and large, you could sort of wall in your opponent or do some silly shenanigans, and you didn't really have any concerns. Now, I think it might be fine to have some kind of structure that's kind of like that. Like, I know in StarCraft 2, sometimes Terrans will do an eBay block on Protoss where they almost fully build it, and then they cancel, and then they just cancel the structure when it's under attack or whatever. I think that even used to happen back in the early days of Brood War, or by early days, I mean like maybe 10 years ago or something. So halfway through its legacy, where I think Terrans were building I can't remember. I think it was also eBays because they're 125 minerals, cheaper than the Academy or whatever. They might use that as like parts of walls, temporary walls and stuff, and then blow those up when they don't need them. So that was kind of interesting to hear about or whatever. And anyway, in general, I don't have anything against that kind of strategy. I just don't think that it should come for free, right? Like, that's the main part that I have a distaste for, we'll say. And it definitely feels like currently, or in the previous economic model at least, Protoss basically got all that for free. You tie that in on top of that, there is this sort of very binary mechanic, we can say, with some degree of certainty. It's a fairly binary mechanic where if the pylon is dead, then the structure is useless. And I think it could be more interesting and also healthier if instead unpowered structures were 50% effective. Meanwhile, I think you would still need the pylon. I believe very strongly that you would still need the pylon to actually warp the structure in, to initiate the construction. So it would still be treated as build area. It just wouldn't be permanently like 100% the case for like that you absolutely need, excuse me, you don't actually need the pylon for general operations. It's definitely something you want, but if you lose the pylon, it just gives you, like, it calls back a little bit of your defender's advantage or whatever. Like if you have wardens, they're shooting slower, etc. And I feel like this is just in general going to be less of a brutal loss, right? As a result of that, that's not the only change I was thinking of course. The other thing I was thinking of is that pylons would probably become more expensive. Nexuses would also be power generators in addition to like Crucibles currently are. I don't know if that would stay with this model, but Nexuses and pylons would be your production. And I think this is, or your building production rather. So you would use them to construct structures, to warp in structures. Now, the other thing about this is I'm not sure if you're I was thinking you would have to channel a structure using one of these structures, so you wouldn't be able to do other functions. So it's not like you can start warping in a pylon and then you can build a scribe from a nexus. You have to channel throughout the entire build time of the scribe or whatever, or of the pylon. And I don't think that means you would start with a pylon, by the way. Like, you would have to figure out a way as a Protoss player, like, okay, where am I going to put my pylon? Like, where am I going to put my first pylon, and when am I going to fit it into my build order and stuff? Because if it's like 100 minerals instead of 50, then you have to figure out where to put it. That also theoretically could open you up to building a production structure first, because the Nexus can support it, right? So you can warp that in there. And I feel like that could be pretty neat. Yeah, I don't know. There's like many options for that, where you have many different kinds of structures, which can also act as production or structure queues, right? Construction queues. So I do think that as a result of all of these ideas, Protoss would be very different, of course, but I kind of like the idea that scribes would just be there for harvesting and scouting and obviously giving you vision with which to warp in. Like there wouldn't be a build area. You wouldn't have to daisy chain your pylons across the map or anything because pylons wouldn't require the idea, right? You also wouldn't require the pylon, like technically you could build like a nexus anywhere with another nexus or something. But obviously if you're trying to build workers, you would also want to use your pylons for that. So yeah, I don't know. Like there's some potential balancing cases where like, obviously this means that you can potentially warp in like a lot of structures at once or whatever. The same way that like Zerg can build a lot of units, you can build a lot of structures very quickly. And so that does definitely change the game quite a bit. It also means that like, you know, a lot of the time your pylons aren't actually doing anything. So maybe they should be, in addition to a power generator, maybe they should be able to do something else. Like maybe they could revise some of the shield battery roll or something, and they could have energy, which gets used to regenerate shields to nearby units or something. Like that was an idea that I had. And if we add that as a third thing that they do, so they build structures, they power structures, and they regenerate shields, we would definitely want to make them a fairly pricey acquisition. But I think that that could all work. The most awkward part about the initial idea for this is that like we have to figure out a way to fit it in without interrupting worker production, right? And so like then maybe I would consider scribes warping in pylons instead of pylons and nexuses and stuff warping in pylons. But I don't know, man. It's a bit awkward, man. It's a bit awkward. So I'm still thinking about that. There are a few things that I have to like quash before I'm 100% confident and comfortable with the idea. But what's alluring about it to me is that it helps you with this identity thing. Like Protoss will definitely feel with the ability to like manifest shit in the middle of nowhere with nothing around. They will definitely feel like the most technologically advanced race. And maybe they already do feel that way to some degree, but I feel like this would be really pretty cool. Like it's almost like Warp Gate for buildings, right? It's kind of neat. A StarCraft 2 Warp Gate, that is. So people might, I think most people figured that one out, but wanted to clarify anyway. And I do think that in addition to that revision, you know, this got me thinking, you know, could Zerg maybe build their structures 50% slower if they were off creep? This is an idea I've gone back and forth with a bunch. I think the interesting aspect of it to me is that as a result of this change, you would basically see macro hatches be a lot faster than expansion hatches. So your base build time would factor both of them in, but lean more towards like, I'm assuming you're expanding with this. But that means that like cut in half would be the time that you spend it, like if you spend it on like within the creep and stuff. Also, of course, it means that you could spread the Kagra using K-Green colonies a little bit earlier. And for those unaware, Kagra is just like my personal name for creep. I renamed even the fucking creep, guys. So that's how dedicated I am to delarding stuff, I guess. But yeah, so it's just an interesting set of ideas. I don't know if we'll get around to attempting them in Brood War, and I don't know to what degree they would actually be super successful, but I think they would help add interesting interactions and meaningful decisions between certain things. Like, obviously the creep is a binary check. Like, if you don't have it, you can't build almost all your structures. And this means that, like, obviously the obvious case that everybody might jump to is like, oh, the Nidus easy and you can place the exit off creep now. It just takes twice as long. I think that's kind of a very elegant, in theory anyway, an elegant system, even though it can mess with your intuition about how fast something can be built. But, you know, I guess you can just click on the unit, and in this case, the structure, and see, oh yeah, it's gaining health, so it's almost done or something. You know what I mean? Like it's halfway done, whatever, based on it being at half health. But I mean, that doesn't always apply. Like maybe you attacked it or something, right? So it's not always the case, right? But it's still possible to get a lot of that stuff implicitly. And you would just basically have two different states for it. It's like, does it have creep on it or not? And if it doesn't, then you know that it's going to build slower. And so you can factor that in or whatever. So yeah, they would all require a lot of adaptation, but I think they would all open up interesting avenues. I think a more, like a less extreme and more conservative revision of the Protoss power thing would be to instantiate the idea that you still need pylons to start structures, but the unpowered state doesn't disable them. It just makes them operate at 50% efficiency. That would at the very least be more meaningful, I guess. But it doesn't fully absolve the idea of the pylon specifically. And I guess we would still probably want the Nexus itself to act as a power field, even if we didn't implement the structure-based construction. So these are all thoughts anyway, but stuff to think about, right? Stuff to think about. And since we're talking so much about Cosmonic Brood War, I should mention that it's not because we're not working on Antikythera. It's not because we're not working on our pitch or anything. We are still definitely working on that stuff. Earlier today, I was talking with Pr0totype about him working on some of the exciting tiles we have, and also some of the more mundane tiles, actually, the ones that, like your dirts and your asphalts and stuff that, you kind of just expect to have. But I've been doing some level design lately. It's actually really interesting because we obviously by default have the north-facing ramps, and we can also, as we get more and more tiles in, we can make more interesting layers and more interesting areas. And it's just really rewarding to see environments, specifically like making maps out of pretty much like entirely homebrew tiles, right? In fact, at this point, I think it is all homebrew. I deleted all of the StarCraft stuff from the engine, so we no longer have like the Blizzard tiles, for example. So we only have what Pr0totype has made for us, and it's, getting better and better, and every week we had something new at the very least. So that's really exciting, and that means that we'll have all sorts of new stuff and be able to do all sorts of new things fairly quickly, actually, fairly soon. It's definitely a time of evolution, a time of change, a time of great change, I would say. And that is what it is upon us. And it's just neat, maybe one of the reasons why I'm thinking of so many wild ideas for CMBW is because I'm reading the writing on the wall that it's probably not something that I'm actually going to be able to implement a lot of these ideas, but I've had some of these ideas in some form or another quite a bit, like for, dancing back and forth in my head, talking about stuff like, here's my idea for the Kagura, where you're deploying your structure off creep, so you take 50% penalty to build time and stuff. Like I've had that idea for like years. I've thought about that. And it's like, okay, if we actually revised it, and we can do it technically, I'm pretty sure, like that might be interesting, right? And so maybe this is my last ditch effort, right? Our collective last ditch effort, because we're talking about the economy that we actually did make a change for. The economy obviously is a big thing, and maybe this is our last ditch effort to improve it and improve the pacing and really explore in a qualitative manner, like what could be done to, alleviate that. And obviously the harvesting method is completely different than in our first game, right? It's very different than in Antikythera, where you actually have workers with collision and stuff, which, hey, Vik has been working a lot on pathfinding recently, and seems like he's got a lead even on the remaining pathing problems, but it also seems like there's not that many pathing problems to be sorted. I mean, there's some performance related stuff, but that stuff can be optimized later. The big ticket items were making it work to begin with, without obviously being so slow that it freezes the game, of course, but you get the idea. It's like, does it work at any scale before does it work at large scale? And we can make it work at large scale later, but we're pretty sure it's working at the default scale. Like your game start scale seems to be working pretty well. And the remaining, I was going to say issues, but I think issue singular, with fingers crossed, is actually something he already has a lead on. It's related to like group movement and stuff. So at the very least, he can continue to iterate on that. And that's really exciting. That's really awesome. I got to give Vik his due anyway, not just because he's doing all the work in Antikythera right now, but also because he was the one to bring to my attention this idea that, diminishing returns on workers wasn't really super notable. It was notable because of the resource nodes, like the yields being different. Obviously, by adding more workers to your base in general, you would have diminishing returns, but that only applied to that one base, because if you ever took workers off of your 8 yields to go to another 8 yield and your other base, you didn't really gain efficiency. You lost stuff until they arrive, like you're losing efficiency until they arrive, and you're not really gaining anything in return. And maybe the argument, and Pr0totype did make this point actually, that maybe the argument then is, oh, well, we need more nodes, and more nodes need to be 4 yields or whatever, and like lower yields in general, so that expanding is more valuable. And this is an observation we actually made a while back, and okay, transferring workers is more valuable if you do that. But in this particular idea, like this change makes it more valuable to expand no matter what you're expanding to and no matter where you're expanding from. As long as there's some minerals, you're going to have you pretty much like, you can obviously create some combinations where it's not worth it, but it's a lot more worth it a lot more often. And I think that change is going to be good because expanding is a part of the game. That's something that we want to do. So all of that is just additional observations, just additional ideas. Of course, stay tuned, right? Watch this space. We're coming in to 2023 pretty hot at this point. This is like, I don't know. I feel like I've recorded like 5 or 6 podcasts, but I'm also thinking of my CSGO talk show just in the last 5 or 6 days, right? I feel like I've recorded that as many podcasts. So I'm in a state where I definitely recognize we have come, all guns blazing into the day, into the year. And we've got a lot of content out there, but yeah, I'm working on content. I'm working on, some co-op stuff for CMBW while we're working on the meta revisions. And we're also thinking about ideas. Even when we're not working, we're thinking. And when we're thinking, we're maybe innovating on RTSs in a way that nobody else bothered to innovate for quite a while. Because we're not adding new ways of having microtransactions. We're adding new ways to have actually interesting interactions and decisions. And that's way better, of course. So all in all, stuff you can get excited about, stuff you can maybe dread, because of course I'll spank that ass if you ever end up facing me in a 1 versus 1, because I actually understand the game sort of, even if I can't actually execute on anything mechanically. And you can also look forward to me slowly updating all of my maps to include more resource nodes while we test this out. But I've got a good feeling about this, guys. Like, you might have some... I definitely had some skepticism when I first played my game, and that's the main reason why I come into this podcast a little bit like, hey guys, don't shoot me, but I have an update. Like a little bit hesitant, but you guys might also have that same hesitation, that same skepticism, but I'm seeing the way this could be pretty epic, and it might just take a couple of tweaks, but I think it might be really quite good, something quite different, and something quite interesting. So stick around and find out. That's my message to you in Prototype episode 7. Obviously, we got a lot of other stuff to talk about in the future. We actually, on our Coffee Crew channel, which is now, again, Ahmed's Arson Isle, we do take questions from those people, and we answer them on our Crow's Nest. And we already have the Crow's Nest episode 7 scheduled, believe it or not. So keeping pace with Prototype, a very new show, of course. And yeah, trying to make that weekly quota, I guess. But if you got questions, ask him. And if you don't, figure out some questions to ask. And if you're not even in the Chad Coffee Crew, then what are you doing, bro? What are you doing? 3, bro. And that is going to be the end of the episode, I think. I think I've done a good enough job explaining myself. I hope so, anyway. And if you guys have any thoughts on the economic changes, obviously put them in the comments below. Put them in my email inbox, which is also where you can send money. Oh, I think it's a different account for the... Oh, no, it is. It's the same account. All right, well, there you go. Money